I had a feeling that my life would take a turn once I transferred to a new school. Having spent my entire childhood in Baltimore, relocating just an hour outside the city was bound to be an adjustment. By adjustment, I meant that I had to accept it. This move was happening whether I liked it or not, thanks to my father's decision and my mother's firm encouragement. They always made sure I stayed out of trouble. The neighborhood I found myself in was quite different from what I was used to. There were only a handful of black families, a few spies, some Italians and Jewish folks, but for the most part, it was dominated by stubborn Dutchmen. They weren't Amish or Mennonites, just German Lutherans who had a strong grip on the community and everything in it. Despite the differences, the place was diverse enough that I managed to blend in without much trouble. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of missing my old friends back in Baltimore. Even after finishing school, I chose to stay in the area, mostly to remain close to my family. I made it a point to visit my old neighborhood regularly and keep in touch with childhood friends. My first real job was driving a fuel oil delivery truck, but within a few years, I had moved into a dispatching role, handling orders from the office. I had a natural knack for the business, and before long, I could picture myself running a company of my own. When it came to socializing, I never had trouble making friends, especially with women. My dating life turned out better than I expected, and eventually, I got married. My mother was a little disappointed that my wife, Barbara, wasn't Italian, but she made an effort to welcome her into the family without hesitation. After our 2 kids were born, Barbara started pestering me to get a haircut. I went along with it, but soon after the kids started school, she had another request. She wanted to go back to work. Now, my father always believed that a wife and mother shouldn't have a job outside the home. I never completely understood his reasoning, but looking back, I could see where he was coming from. It wasn't that I opposed Barbara working, but I wasn't exactly thrilled about her reconnecting with old acquaintances from her past. Some of her friends were fine, but others rubbed me the wrong way. In high school, she had been involved in every club and student activity imaginable. She absolutely thrived on it. I, on the other hand, stayed away from all of that. To me, those groups were nothing more than a bunch of self-important kids patting each other on the back. I knew Barbara had been sexually active before we got together, just as I had, but it was never something we discussed. There wasn't any unspoken rule about it. We just never felt the need to bring it up. Things between us were steady for about 11 years, but then everything started to unravel. Barbara had taken a job in the claims department of a well-known insurance company in town, and at first, I didn't think much of it. But then she began staying late at work and putting in extra hours on weekends. After 7 months of this, I knew something wasn't right. The final straw came when she told me about a work seminar. She mentioned that it was only for 4 days and that she had already spoken to my mother, who had agreed to watch the kids. She assured me that I'd be home in the evenings and could manage cooking for myself. The casual way she brought it up stunned me. She acted as if it were nothing. I asked her who else would be going, and she hesitated before listing 6 other women from the department, Betty Klink from HR, and Louis. The moment she said his name, I smirked. I was honestly surprised that she hadn't figured out by now that I knew all about her little lunch dates and so-called late-night work sessions with her boss, Louis Brown. Louis and Barbara had known each other since high school. He was one of those guys who got involved in every club and student event, everything except sports. I had never liked him much back then, and I liked him even less now. I looked her in the eye and asked if she really thought I was a fool. She looked confused, insisting that she didn't understand what I was talking about. But I had known about her and Louis for 7 months, and I made it clear that I wasn't about to let her run off with him for 4 days. She immediately denied it, saying Louis was just her boss and that she would never think of cheating on me. I didn't argue. Instead, I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and grabbed another Camberg lager. As I popped the tab and took a sip, she sat there in silence, waiting for me to say something. I told her that as the mother of my children, she had done a good job. That was the only reason I hadn't thrown her out of the house already. She looked at me, wide-eyed, and asked what I meant by that. I told her that I had spoken to my mother about everything. My mother had advised me to stand my ground for the sake of the kids and see if Barbara could pull herself together. But if I left, the court would give her custody, and I couldn't let that happen. She asked if I had told my mother she was cheating. I admitted that I hadn't. I hadn't needed to. Someone from church had told her, and when she asked me about it, I simply hadn't denied it. Her face went pale. She said she didn't believe me and wanted to know why I was saying all of this. I took another sip of beer and smirked. I told her that Louis lived just 3 blocks from her office and that she went to his place about twice a week, staying for nearly 2.5 hours each time. I wanted to know what she was doing in his apartment for that long, and while she was at it, I suggested she explain all that supposed overtime she had been putting in at the office. Then I dropped the final piece of information. The cleaning lady at her office also went to church with my mother. Barbara's shoulders slumped, and her lower lip quivered. I told her that as long as she didn't publicly embarrass me or my family, we didn't have to take this any further. From that moment on, I made it clear that I wouldn't take any action, unless something changed. If it did, all bets were off. Barbara could stay or leave, but there was one thing I would never allow. She would never take my boys away from me. She was furious. Jumping to her feet, she cursed at me, something she had never done before. Through her sobs, she spat out that she hated me, calling me a bastard. It was also the first time she had ever thrown a slur about my Dutch heritage in my face. Whatever self-control she had been holding onto had finally cracked. We had 2 boys, Arlo and Max, who shared a room with a bunk bed. The 3rd bedroom had always been multipurpose, but from that day forward, it became mine. I slept there alone. We were still living in a rented house, and we had over $65,000 set aside for a down payment on our dream home, but that dream had turned into a complete nightmare. Nothing more was said about the seminar. Barbara stopped working overtime and began carrying her lunch to the office instead of going out. On the surface, things seemed to return to normal. Mom wasn't hearing any new gossip from her church friends, and to an outsider, everything probably looked fine. But I could feel it. The air in the house wasn't just cold, it was frozen solid. At that point, there was no intimacy between us, and I wasn't about to tolerate that situation for long. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go with Barbara to her company's Christmas party. I didn't want her going alone, and I figured if I just kept to myself, I could get through the evening without any issues. It seemed like a solid plan, but in reality, it was full of flaws. The company had rented out a banquet hall with a dance floor, a buffet, and a couple of open bars. I knew I could have 3 beers over the course of the night and still keep my senses about me. By the time we arrived, the only open tables were the ones closest to the company's top executives. Clearly, most of the employees were avoiding them. For the first hour, everything seemed to be fine. I spotted Louis at the other end of the room, chatting with his usual group. A few of Barbara's co-workers asked her to dance, which I didn't mind. I had no interest in dancing myself. I let her go, thinking nothing of it. I had just cracked open my 3rd beer when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Barbara and Louis were exchanging looks, not words, just subtle nods and head tilts. It wasn't obvious to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but I saw it. Something was happening. I forced myself to act indifferent, but I didn't take my eyes off them. A little while later, Barbara excused herself to go to the restroom. I casually glanced around the room and realized Louis was gone, too. That was all the confirmation I needed. The sheer audacity of it was almost unbelievable. After everything that had happened, she still thought she could sneak off with him right under my nose? It was ridiculous. If she wanted to meet up with him, she could have done it at work without any risk of me catching her. The only reason she would do it here, in front of everyone, was to humiliate me, to put the horns on me in the middle of her workplace. Louis's usual crew stood by one of the bars, grinning to themselves, like they were in on some kind of joke. I saw Barbara step into the hallway leading to the restrooms, but before she disappeared, she glanced back, checking to see if I was still in my seat. That was the final straw. I made my way across the room, but instead of heading straight to the restrooms, I stopped by the executive's table. I leaned in and politely apologized for disrupting their party, making sure I had their full attention. At the same time, I caught sight of Louis's buddies from across the hall. The second they noticed me, their grins vanished. They looked uneasy, probably because they had no idea how they were going to help their friend out of this mess. I checked the women's restroom first, but it was empty. That only left one place to look. As soon as I stepped into the men's room, I found them. Louis had his back to me, his hand already up Barbara's skirt. There was no hesitation on her part. She wasn't pushing him away, wasn't resisting. That was all I needed to see. I grabbed him by the back of the neck and yanked him sideways, slamming his head into the tiled wall. Something cracked. Maybe it was the tile. Maybe it was his face. I didn't care. Barbara was screaming my name over and over, but I barely heard her. I turned Louis around, and blood from his busted nose splattered onto my shirt. He was wobbling on his feet, but he wasn't down yet, so I drove a punch into his stomach. He crumpled instantly, hitting the floor and vomiting all over himself. Barbara clung to my sleeve, begging me to stop, but I ignored her. The main hall had gone silent. The music had stopped. Every single person in that room was watching as I dragged Louis across the floor by his tie. I must have been choking him, but I couldn't have cared less. The orchestra had stopped playing, and all eyes were on me as I tossed him forward like a piece of garbage. I scanned the room, wondering if anyone would step in to help Louis, but no one seemed eager to get involved. Not a single person moved. That suited me just fine. Without hesitation, I turned to the crowd and made my final statement before leaving. I let them know I was sorry for ruining their fancy party, but since my wife had already put on a show for them, I figured she might as well stay for their entertainment. I told them to drop her off at the house whenever they were done with her. Louis was still on his hands and knees, struggling to get up. His face was a mess, blood smeared across his skin, and his body trembling from the blows he had taken. Barbara stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth slightly open. I couldn't tell if she was more upset about what I had done to her so-called lover or about what I had just said in front of her co-workers. Either way, I didn't care. Before I turned to leave, I noticed Louis standing right under a sprig of mistletoe. That was just too good to pass up. Without thinking twice, I stepped forward and drove my foot straight into his groin. He let out a choked sound, crumpling immediately. His face hit the floor again with a dull thud. That had to hurt. The entire room remained silent. No one moved, no one spoke. I left them standing there in shock and walked out. Once I got to my car, I pulled out my phone and called my mother. I told her to stop by the house and pick up the boys. Leaving town for a few days seemed like the right move, and I wasn't about to leave my kids with Barbara. I didn't trust her to take care of them properly, not in the state she was in. I had no real plan, just the urge to get away. I made decisions as I went along, not knowing exactly where I would end up. When I called my boss and asked for some time off, he had no problem giving me a week or so. That was one less thing to worry about. By the time I arrived home, my parents were already there. After paying the babysitter, I packed a quick bag for the boys, stuffing it with their clothes and whatever essentials they needed. My own packing was rushed. I threw in socks, underwear, a couple of shirts, and a pair of pants just in case. Before leaving, I went down to the basement and retrieved a box of cash I had stashed in the rafters. Banks were offering less than 1% interest on savings accounts, so I had decided long ago that I'd rather keep my money at home. I know. It sounds ridiculous keeping $64,000 in cash lying around, but I guess I got that habit from my mother. She had always hidden money in different spots around the kitchen, tucked away like little surprises. Just as I was about to shut off the lights and leave, a cab pulled up outside. Barbara stepped out and walked into the house without a word. She sat down on the couch, looking more troubled than angry, more frustrated than scared. I stood there for a moment before speaking. I reminded her that I had only ever set one rule: never humiliate me or my family in public. But she just couldn't help herself. She had done exactly that. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat there, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. I waited a little while, giving her time to cry if she wanted to, but I had nothing left to say. Without another word, I walked out the door. It was a little after 8:45 p.m. when I pulled onto the Riverbend Parkway. The party hadn't lasted long, at least not for me. I had been there less than 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity. I figured a few days in Bayfront City would do me good before heading home. But first, I needed to see an old friend. Hugo owned a sandwich shop in our old neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy like the places you'd see in Baltimore road trip movies, just a small convenience for locals. But that shop wasn't where his real money came from. His main business was in other areas, the kind most people either ignored or quietly took part in. Hugo lived upstairs and ran his real business out of the back room. Seeing him again felt like a reunion. After I explained what had happened, he nodded, already thinking ahead. He didn't hesitate. He told me straight up that handling this situation was going to cost me $22,000. He asked if I could manage it, or if I needed backup. I assured him that I could pay it forward with no problem. Then he got to the point. Did I want it done messy or clean? Loud or quiet? No fuss, no commotion, just a clean resolution? I told him I hadn't planned anything yet, but I was thinking about heading to Bayfront City for a few days. He nodded and suggested 6 days, 7 nights at the Mirage Club Casino. I wasn't sure what he was getting at, so I asked what he meant. Hugo smirked. He said he had some people in mind who could make my trip more enjoyable. He figured it would be profitable for me. That sounded fine to me. When he asked if I was going alone, I told him yes. This whole thing had unfolded so quickly that I hadn't even thought about bringing anyone along. He shook his head and told me I didn't have to be alone. I needed someone to confirm that I was there. Without waiting for my response, he picked up the phone and dialed a number. I listened as he spoke. Jessica, it's Hugo. Get yourself ready and come over here. There was a brief pause, and then he chuckled before hanging up. Turning back to me, he asked if I remembered Jessica, his brother Michael's eldest daughter. I did. She had been the chubby little girl with dark brown eyes who was always laughing. I asked how old she was now. Hugo smiled at my memory of her. She was 24 now, he said, and she wasn't chubby anymore. That's when it hit me. Jessica was going to Bayfront City with me. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. She was Hugo's niece, and it felt a little strange. But he had set it up, so I wasn't about to argue. Then he asked if I had any credit cards. I told him I had 2 and planned on canceling them first thing Monday morning. He waved that off and told me not to do that. Instead, he wanted me to use the cards as much as possible, for food, room service, even some cash advances at the casino. He warned me not to go overboard, just enough to leave a solid paper trail. It might cost me a few thousand, but it was cheap insurance. Hugo knew what he was talking about, and the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I was still thinking everything over when Jessica walked in. She greeted me warmly, saying she hadn't seen me since I moved to Ridgewood Village and that I looked good. At that moment, I finally understood why Hugo had been smiling earlier. Jessica was breathtaking. Her dark eyes were striking, and whatever baby fat she had carried as a kid had now settled in all the right places. Jumping to my feet too quickly, I knocked over my chair like an idiot. Hugo wasted no time, cutting straight to the point. He told Jessica that I needed someone to keep me company in Bayfront City for a few days, and asked if she'd be willing to go. Her expression shifted slightly at the suggestion. She turned to me and asked if I was still married. Before I could answer, Hugo jumped in again, making it clear that my marriage was over. He told her that what I really needed right now was a nurse and mentioned that he knew she had always liked me, which was why she was the first person he thought of. Jessica didn't look convinced. She made it clear she wasn't about to destroy someone's family and that it wasn't fair of Hugo to ask her. She also added, rather firmly, that she wasn't one of his working girls, so if that's what he had in mind, he should send someone else. Hugo reassured her that he wasn't asking for anything like that. He just wanted her to keep me company and help me take my mind off my problems. A brief moment of realization flickered across Jessica's face, like something had just clicked for her. Not only was she beautiful, but she was sharp. Her gaze shifted from Hugo to me, and after a slight smile, she said she'd love to go, as long as I promised to buy her some saltwater taffy. That broke the tension, and soon all 3 of us were smiling. She said she'd need about an hour to get ready, then turned back to Hugo and told him not to give me anything to drink in the meantime. She didn't want to deal with a drunk. As she walked away, I could swear I caught a little wink from her. While she was gone, Hugo and I went over our conversation again. He was more than happy to take my $22,500 and assured me that I would be completely satisfied with the results. The trip to Bayfront City was uneventful. The only real hiccup was that I had to fill Jessica in on everything that had happened with Barbara. She listened without much reaction, and when I finished, the only thing she said was that she felt sorry for the kids. When we checked into the hotel, Jessica frowned at the sight of the double beds. She didn't say anything about it, but I caught myself grinning slightly. I already had a feeling that, before long, we'd only be needing one of them. These things had a way of working themselves out. We gambled a little, but nothing too serious. I had enough sense to know that the house always wins in the end. Jessica was happy playing the quarter slots, and I was mostly just looking for ways to pass the time. We spent more time eating and strolling along the waterfront than anything else. Naturally, we made sure to see every show in town. The first night, I kept things respectful, but by noon on the second day, Jessica and I were already tearing up the sheets. My mother had been right. I should have married an Italian woman. It felt natural, like something that was supposed to happen. And, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was cheating. On the fourth day, we were getting ready for dinner when there was an unexpected knock at the door. Two men stood there, not in suits, but in sports jackets. The taller one spoke first. He introduced himself as Joseph Smith and his partner as Albert Jones, both from the Rockford County Major Crimes Unit. They wanted to have a word with me. Just then, Jessica stepped out of the bathroom, wearing nothing but her bra and panties. She glanced at the two men, then casually walked over to the bed, picked up her robe, and slipped it on. She seemed a little embarrassed, but I had warned her that we might get a visit. I asked them what exactly they wanted to talk about. Fritz was polite but direct. They wanted to discuss my relationship with Louis Brown. I told them the truth. I didn't have a relationship with Louis, my wife did. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. Fritz tried to keep the conversation going, but his partner seemed distracted, sneaking glances at Jessica. They assured me they understood that part. What they were really here about was the fact that I had confronted Louis at the Hamilton Insurance Christmas party the previous Friday. I asked them if he was pressing charges. Fritz shook his head. That wasn't the issue. Louis had disappeared, and they were hoping I could help them find him. That was interesting. I kept my expression neutral and told them that, before we discussed anything further, I wanted someone from the Bayfront City Police Department in the room. And not just a regular officer. I wanted a detective. If they couldn't arrange that, then I'd need a lawyer from Harrison and Mills, my firm back in Baltimore. Neither of them reacted to that. They just stood there, unreadable. Jessica was already getting dressed while I grabbed my jacket. I told them I was sorry, but we had dinner reservations at 6:15 p.m. and couldn't afford to be late. I even threw in a casual mention about how the steaks at Redwood Grill were fantastic. Then, as I adjusted my cuffs, I made a point to ask, what made them so sure something had happened to Louis? Maybe he just skipped town for a while. That got a reaction. Fritz said that Louis had been picked up by a cab leaving Rockford County Hospital early Sunday morning, and since then, no one had seen or heard from him. That was the last thing he said before Jessica and I stepped out the door. I had been at the Mirage Club Casino since Friday night, and if they wanted proof, they could check with the hotel staff. That was all I had to say on the matter. With that, I made it clear that Jessica and I were heading out for steaks. If they had any further questions, they could wait until Friday, when I would be back in town. Fritz didn't push any further. He simply stated that they expected to see me then. I gave him a nod, then guided them toward the door. We all took the elevator down together in silence. Once we reached the lobby, they went off to speak with hotel security while Jessica and I made our way to the Redwood Grill. By the time I got home, Arlo and Max were all over me, excited to see me again. The saltwater taffy I brought back helped make things even better. Barbara, on the other hand, was distant. She wasn't angry or outwardly hostile, just cold and detached. It was obvious she didn't fully understand where things stood. After dealing with the police, I spent the rest of the day with the boys. Later that evening, once the kids settled down in front of the TV, I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for Barbara to finish cleaning up. She took longer than usual, but I wasn't going anywhere. Eventually, she turned around and sat down across from me, resting her elbows on the ceramic countertop. The first thing she asked was what I had done to Louis. She wasn't accusing me, and she wasn't angry. If anything, she seemed genuinely concerned. She looked straight at me, then let her eyes drift around the room as if waiting for me to explain. I met her gaze and told her I had been in Bayfront City all week. I hadn't seen Louis since the party. She muttered that she hoped that was true, then said he had been in the hospital for 2 days. His jaw was broken. His nose was fractured. I didn't hesitate when I told her he had deserved it. That seemed to be the end of her questions, so I asked a few of my own. First, I wanted to know what she had been doing with Louis in the men's room. She didn't answer. I gave it a few moments before speaking again. I asked why Louis had put his hand up her skirt. Still, nothing. Barbara clenched her hands together, staring at the countertop as if it would somehow provide her with an excuse. I changed the subject. I asked why she wasn't at work and why the kids were home on a school day. She admitted that she had quit her job. There was no way she could go back there after everything that had happened. As for the boys, she had pulled them out of school for the day because my mother had told her I would be home. I let that sit for a moment before getting to the real issue. She had broken the only rule I had ever given her. It wasn't complicated. She couldn't humiliate me or my family. That was all I had asked. Yet, she had done exactly that. I wanted to know why. Why had she and Louis decided that they just had to do this? The longer we sat there, the more nervous she became. When she still didn't answer, I slammed my fist down on the tabletop and demanded that she tell me. She flinched but finally spoke. She didn't know why. It had just happened. She claimed that seeing me sitting alone in the corner like a lost puppy had made them think they could take advantage of the situation. She insisted that they never expected me to react the way I had. According to her, I had been acting crazy, and she had been terrified. At least I had finally gotten a real reaction out of her. Of course, none of what she said made any sense. I didn't even bother analyzing her words. They had weeks before the party to sneak around, and I would have never known. But no, they had chosen to do it there, in that moment, in that place, because they wanted to humiliate me. No amount of her rambling was going to change that. I made it clear to her that she had three choices. She could stay and be a decent mother to our kids. She could leave and file for divorce, but the boys would not be going with her. Or she could disappear entirely. If she stayed, our marriage would be over in every way except on paper. We wouldn't live as husband and wife, and I wouldn't tolerate another affair. Not with Louis, not with anyone. At the mention of Louis's name, Barbara broke down. She pushed away from the table, ran out of the room, and burst into tears. That was fine. We'd finish the conversation tomorrow. I knew changes had to be made. I rented a small apartment just a few blocks from the house, close enough that the boys could visit whenever they wanted. Jessica moved in with me. The police came by a few more times with their questions, but eventually, they stopped. Louis Brown had been picked up by a cab outside Rockford County Hospital, and after that, he was never seen again. His family put up a reward for information, but no one came forward. I still had dinner with Barbara and the boys every night, and I made sure to spend as much time with my kids as possible on weekends. It was clear to everyone that Barbara and I were no longer a couple, even though we remained legally married. She spent a lot of time with her parents and sister, and I had no issue with that. As far as I could tell, she wasn't seeing anyone else. She had quit her job right after the Christmas party and showed no interest in finding another one. We never did finish the conversation from that first night I got home. Instead, she played the part of a good mother. The house was always clean, the boys were well fed, and their clothes were always neatly kept. It was almost as if she was trying to make up for everything without saying a word. I handled all the lawn care and outdoor work, while Barbara received $250 each week for household expenses, groceries, and personal needs. I always asked if she needed more, but she never took it. We no longer had credit cards. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, the boys and I spent time with my family, and Jessica usually joined us. Barbara spent the holidays with her own family, but Christmas Eve was always reserved for the boys. Whenever Arlo or Max brought up the subject of my relationship with their mother, things got awkward. Neither Barbara nor I ever discussed it with them, and I appreciated that she never tried to justify what had happened. But in the end, what could she have said? This arrangement continued for years. Of course, my quick summary barely scratches the surface of what was really happening. There were constant difficulties, disagreements, and tension, but somehow, we managed. At first, Jessica and I were doing well together. Over time, though, she began spending more and more time with her family in Baltimore and less time with me. I couldn't blame her. She had made the breakup easier for me to bear, and I owed her for that. Still, no matter how I felt, I couldn't divorce Barbara. As long as the boys lived at home, I couldn't kick her out either. Those were the rules I had set for myself, and despite how much I hated the situation, I stuck to them. Arlo, however, had his own ideas. He was 16 when everything came to a head. A new student at school turned out to be related to Louis Brown and made a habit of harassing Arlo about what had happened between our families. It was the first time Arlo had ever been confronted with it, and he wasn't ready for it. By the time it was over, Louis's nephew had landed in the hospital. I had to go pick Arlo up from school, where he was facing a 2-week suspension and an assault charge. Max had been caught in the middle of the chaos, trying to help his older brother. He walked away with 2 missing teeth, but earned Arlo's admiration for standing up for him. When we got home, Barbara was waiting at the door. Arlo didn't hesitate. He immediately started laying into her, demanding to know why she had never told them about what had happened years ago. She didn't get defensive. She just stood there and listened as her son unloaded all his anger. I left them to it and took Max to the dentist. He didn't seem too upset about his missing teeth, but I wasn't thrilled about the upcoming dental bill. When we got back, Barbara was gone. Her car was still parked in the driveway, but she had taken her purse and left without a word. Arlo said she hadn't given him any explanation. She had just walked out. I took a week off work to try and straighten things out. I reached out to her parents and sister, but they refused to speak to me. By the end of the week, I still had no idea where she was or what she planned to do. With no answers, I made the decision to move forward. Jessica and I moved into the house. At first, sleeping in the same bed felt strange, but the boys adjusted much faster than I expected. Then, one afternoon while I was at work, everything in the house that had belonged to Barbara, or had anything to do with her, disappeared. I had no idea what Jessica did with it, and I never asked. She took over all the chores Barbara had once done. I got her some credit cards to make things easier, and the irony wasn't lost on me. I trusted my mistress more than I had ever trusted my wife. I sold Barbara's car and bought a new one for Jessica. With the new arrangement, family gatherings became far less stressful. Jessica was happier. My mother was thrilled. The boys weren't having any more problems at school, and Louis's nephew never showed up again. Things were finally looking up, but I was still legally married. I waited 2 months before filing a missing persons report. Technically, I listed Barbara as a runaway spouse, so I could use that when I filed for divorce. After another 2 months, I submitted the paperwork. The court required 1 year of abandonment before granting the divorce, but I had planned everything in advance. At home, everything had settled into a new normal. Arlo and Max accepted Jessica completely. They never called her Mom. She was always just Jessica, but that was fine. We felt more like a real family than we had in years. Then, one day, I made the final decision. Once the 1-year waiting period was over, I was legally free. 2 weeks later, Jessica and I drove to Elton and got married. We were a family again. Arlo graduated from high school and joined the Air Force. A year later, Max decided to go to meat cutting school in Toledo. Everything seemed to be happening so fast. Before I knew it, Jessica and I were alone. We never heard from Barbara again. Mom and Dad moved to Bayshore College and made everyone promise to visit at least twice a year. With no reason to stay in Reading, Jessica and I packed up and moved back home to Baltimore. After graduating, Max got a job at an upscale butcher shop in Westfield. We saw him a few times a month, and he always showed up with something delicious to surprise us with. About a year later, one of Jessica's nieces was getting married, and of course, we had to go. An Italian wedding in Baltimore was always a big deal. Big in the sense that half the city seemed to show up. Plenty of relatives, plenty of freeloaders looking for booze and free food. But none of it mattered. There was always more than enough of everything to go around. We were sitting with friends, enjoying the evening, when I noticed Jessica seemed a little nervous. Jessica kept glancing across the dance floor like she was focused on something. I followed her line of sight a few times, but didn't notice anything unusual. I let it go until she excused herself to the ladies' room. Something felt off. I watched her walk to the end of the hall, where she ran into an old friend. They chatted for a while, striking a few casual poses, but nothing about it seemed suspicious. She didn't head toward the break room, but instead approached one of Hugo's personal assistants. I saw her motion toward a table where her friend had been sitting. There were 3 men and 3 women at that table, and they didn't look like they belonged. The guys were dressed like they were trying too hard to impress, and the women, a little too polished, carried themselves with a certain predatory energy. When Jessica returned, there was a confident but serious expression on her face. She told me there was a problem. I had already pieced together that something was wrong, but I asked her to explain it anyway. She told me to stay calm because, in just a few minutes, one of the men at Joan's table was going to come in and try to start a fight with me. I didn't like where this was going. Jessica explained that the guy was planning to insult her, pushing me into a confrontation. The moment I stepped outside to deal with him, his two friends would jump in, and they'd all try to put me in the hospital. I asked her what she expected me to do. Just let it happen? She told me to play along, at least until Toby V and the boys had time to get into position. I might have to deal with one of them, but that would be the worst of it. I asked what she meant by play along, and she said that no matter what he said, I had to act like it didn't bother me. If he called her something ugly, I should just joke about it. Maybe even ask him how much he was willing to pay for her. The important thing was not to let him push my buttons. None of this made sense to me. I wanted to know what I had done to deserve this kind of setup. Jessica simply told me to look at Joan's table again. When I did, she told me to focus on the woman with the short platinum hair. I looked closer, and everything clicked. It was Barbara. I couldn't believe it. I had no idea what she was doing there. Jessica filled me in. Barbara's new boyfriend was somehow connected to the groom's fiancé, and when she realized I was at the wedding, she decided to set me up. Apparently, she was still holding a grudge and saw this as her chance for payback. While I handled things outside, Jessica and Joan planned to have a little chat with Barbara in the ladies' room. Jessica assured me it wouldn't be pretty. I didn't like where this was heading. This was a wedding, and the young bride would remember this night for the rest of her life. It wasn't fair for a couple of lowlifes to ruin it for her. About 10 minutes later, I saw Barbara's boyfriend push his chair back and get up. I stood as well, excusing myself from the table. Jessica threw me a strange look, but didn't say anything. I casually made my way toward the side fire exit, the same place everyone went to smoke. The guy tilted his head slightly, and right on cue, his two buddies stood up and followed. What they didn't realize was that coming up behind them, from the back of the bar, were 3 of Hugo's men, each carrying a wooden baseball bats they kept behind the counter. 6 guys were already outside by the fire exit, smoking. I told them to clear out, and without hesitation, they did. I guess there was something in my voice that told them this wasn't their fight. I walked about 20 steps away from the door, then stopped and turned around. The 3 punks walked out, all smiles, until they heard the door shut behind them. That's when the smiles vanished. They turned to see the 3 guys with bats and the father of the bride standing behind them. It was over in less than 30 seconds. I never even had to throw a punch. When it was done, I turned to the bride's father and apologized for the trouble. He told me he appreciated that I had enough respect to take the situation outside. We shook hands, and he returned to his daughter. I thanked Hugo's boys for their help and went to find Jessica. They stayed behind to handle the cleanup. By then, Barbara's table was empty. Jessica was gone too. Max was sitting with a few of his friends. He had already heard about the commotion and found me at the bar as I was ordering another drink. He walked up to me and asked what the hell was going on. I considered keeping quiet, but that wouldn't have worked. I kept it simple and told him his mother had been there with her new boyfriend. That was all he needed to know. Max smiled, turned to the bartender, and ordered a beer. We sat and talked about other things for about an hour. Finally, Jessica showed up. Her hair was a little messy, and she looked like she had been through something. When I asked where she had been, she gave me a sly smile and said she and Joan had taken Barbara to the hospital because she wasn't feeling well. Max and I couldn't help but laugh. Jessica asked if we could go home. It had been a long night, but honestly, it had also been a hell of a lot of fun. We never saw Barbara again. Jessica and I are still together, back in the old neighborhood, and life is good.